Well, good morning, everyone. It's just gone 9 o'clock, so we reconvene the hearing of the consent applications lodged by Cold Gold Clutha Limited. And at this stage, we're hearing from the two council reporting officers, Kirsten Royce for the District Council and Councils, and Josie Burrows and any other for the ORC and any other technical experts that they may wish to have address us. Just before we turn to the reporting officers, Ms. Irving, anything from the applicant this morning before we hear from the officers? Great, thank you. All right, so in terms of the reporting officers, is it still the case that ORC is going first?
Yes, the plan is to have Ms. Barnett first, followed by Mr. Denny.
Yes.
Followed by myself and Ms. Royce.
Excellent. Now, we've received end of hearing reports from both Ms. Royce and Ms. Burrows, so thank you very much for that. But given that particularly, this is no criticism, Ms. Burrows, yours came in this morning. We appreciate that you've been working on that overnight. So what we'll do is for both Ms. Royce and Ms. Burrows, we'll just have those reports read out to us. We're not going to run out of time, and I think for the benefit of other participants who may be watching on Zoom, if anyone is, then it would be beneficial to have those reports read out as well. All right, so let's proceed with the ORC end of hearing team. So have we got someone on Zoom or? Good morning. Can you see and hear us?
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
Great. Do you want to introduce yourself to the hearing?
My name's Treffry Barnett. I'm a senior ecologist with Bioresearchers, Babbage Consultants Limited. We've been working as a environmental consultant for over 30 years, and I have been primarily practicing within rivers, streams and coastal ecosystems.
Excellent. And you have a presentation to make to us this morning?
No, I have just been asked to be present to answer questions. I've reviewed the evidence by Dr. Young and Mr. Hammer, and I have viewed the hearing proceedings for both of those participants.
All right. Well, I guess the key question in our mind is in terms of the evidence provided to us by Dr. Young, both his primary statement and the additional written information that he provided to us regarding the efficacy of a turbidity meter and measurement of turbidity. Key question in our mind is there any element of Dr. Young's evidence that you disagree with?
Primarily to do with the turbidity and the clarity.
Sorry, what
sorry, is this just in relation to the turbidity and clarity or the overall evidence?
No, the overall evidence of Dr. Young, so both his primary statement that Dr. Duxon provided to us and his supplementary information in response to our questions. Is there any element of Dr. Young's evidence to us that you disagree with?
Yes, I thought there was an overemphasis on the fact that the primary source of water for the Clutha was the lake, when you've got the Cadrona River coming in from the west and the Hawa River coming in from the east. The Cadrona River itself has almost 30 kilometres of length, all of which is picking up soils and sediment and organic matter from the contributing catchment, which isn't being retained by a lake. And there are multiple tributaries into the receiving environment where the Cold Gold works are proposed. So all of those would be having an effect on the overall water quality and the flows into the river and the disturbance levels of the river. So it wasn't quite as a pristine environment as sort of portrayed by Dr. Young, that there's actually a lot of other inputs going into the river. The other aspect that I had an issue with was the caddisflies. Caddisflies actually have a very high MCI, so there's only 2 that have very low MCIs, and they're deliberately excluded from the MCI calculations and the methodology. And so the rest of the MCI for caddisflies are actually, between 5 and 10, which is high. So I didn't quite understand that argument that the MCIs were so low because of the prevalence of caddisflies in the river. I had a series of notes which I sent through to, excuse me, so I sent through this morning, and I've been sending iterations through where I was specifically looking at the different aspects of his evidence. So if I can just if you give me a minute, I'll just pull those up on my screen, and then I can just go through them in a bullet point in a more organised fashion.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the first thing I looked at was the water clarity, and this comes back to those other inputs that we were talking about, and that the water clarity on average at Luggets Bridge was 5 metres, but that was the average, which by definition half of it's above that, but half of it is below that, and so the water clarity readings down there were as low as 0.01. So, sorry, 0.1 metre. And that was recorded last year. So it's not as if the site is always maintaining clear water. And so I just felt that perspective wasn't added in there. The MCI scores for that area were an attribute band D, which is very poor when we want to be looking at attribute band A for macroinvertebrates. And that I said it's important to note that macroinvertebrate samples are collected typically from wadeable streams and not deep in rivers. And so there's very little good information within New Zealand about what is actually in the bottom of the rivers. But and that's primarily because sampling in deep rivers is accompanied by physical difficulties and health and safety problems. All rivers and streams in New Zealand have periodic inputs of fine sediment, including the Clutha, and our fauna and our macroinvertebrate fauna is actually pretty robust to these. So this is an area that I've spent a lot of time working with. And so, and that said, that I agree that a high degree of disturbance can smother and kill the macroinvertebrates, but it's important to understand that most of these macroinvertebrate communities are larval stages of flying insects. They're caddisflies, they're mayflies, they're stoneflies, they're transitory. And so they are in the aquatic environment for a period of time, just the larval stage, and most of that happens on the edges of the river, where the adults can actually lay their eggs on stones and on vegetation, and then the larvae move into appropriate environments. I dealt with some flow data. Yeah, so there's 40 kilometres of the Cadrona River, and which comes in, so that was even more than what I said initially, and 16 kilometres of the Hawa River, and the Hawea River is is lake fed, but the Cadrona River is definitely not. And these are all significant inputs. That is not even including all the tributaries that run into the river. So then on to the first question that you asked regarding the turbidity and the clarity. I agree that the clarity is a very good measure, but I cannot see any feasible way of doing clarity measurements from a boat in the middle of a river like the Clutha. It is physically, it'd be dangerous, and it would be, I just can't see how the logistics would work. The turbidity meter solution, I feel, is the best solution, and there is some there's some very good meters there out on the market, and some have a very high degree of accuracy. Into the region of 0.02 NTU. So that's well within the range of being able to detect effects. But I also feel that if a trigger level or a standard was set, that it should be brought in line with the ANZAC guidelines or the more recent guidelines or the current council guidelines. And then those guidelines are set for the protection of aquatic ecosystems. And so that the trigger level should be associated with that, because then you have got a realistic and a well thought out guideline to work with. The other thing was that came up with the water clarity involving Secchi discs or tubes or black disc is they're actually relatively subjective on the user. So there's a degree of error, whereas if you're using a meter and the meter is regularly serviced and it is really, really calibrated, then there's less of an operator error involved. That's probably where I finished all my comments regarding Dr. Young's evidence and his presentation.
Mm-hmm. So what's your overall conclusion on the potential adverse effects of the application before us on aquatic ecology and water quality?
That the effects will be localised, that the effects will be temporary, and that there'll be no significant adverse effects on at-risk or endangered fauna, native fauna. I think that the applicant has made a considered effort to avoid the more sensitive areas where you would have potential for at-risk fauna to be present, and that's primarily around the confluences and the tributaries and the areas where you've got extensive braiding or that the river is showing a really high degree of diversity.
Right, thank you. I'll see if we have any further questions. Craig, any further questions?
No, I could get that in writing. That was quite a lot.
Yeah.
I don't have any questions, but I agree it should be in writing, yes.
Yes, so what we've just discussed amongst ourselves, no further questions, but the answers that you've given us this morning, we'd appreciate you documenting those in writing and providing them through to Tamsin, our hearings administrator, so we can have a copy of that.
Certainly.
All right, thank you. Thanks for coming in this morning.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Who's next? On the Zoom? Yep. Is there a Mr. Denny on Zoom?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can hear you, but we can't
Right.
see you, which isn't crucial, but would be nice. Have you turned your camera on?
Hello.
If we can't see you, it detracts from the visual amenity of your presentation.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you, but we can't see you.
Jeez.
Yeah, we can still hear you.
Maybe we'll just proceed with the vocals. There we go.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you and we can see you. Can you hear us?
Maybe not.
So I have no audio. I can't hear you. I mean, I can hear you, but I don't think you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you. Jesus. Can you hear us?
No.
Maybe send him a message to say there's a glitch at his end. Can you message him, say, yeah, sometimes people with headphones, it doesn't work. Take your headphones off and use the speaker on the laptop.
Ah,
There we go.
Can you hear me now?
yes.
Yes, no, we can hear you. We've been able to hear you the whole time. Can you hear us?
No. That was a good sigh.
No. Jesus.
It's been seamless today, isn't it?
Yeah, the magical, universal
Fix all.
fix-it. If in doubt, reboot. We'll just give it a few more minutes, and if necessary, we can come back to him later.
Could he just ring in?
You could do. Not sure how that'll work for anyone watching it on Zoom.
No, that's true.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
5-minute recess.
pardon?
5-minute recess.
Oh, we can just proceed with Josie. She's got a lot to read. Ms. Burrows, let's turn to your report and we can come back to Mr. Denny once we get the technical issues sorted out. So thank you for providing your report. Yeah, so could you just message Mr. Denny and tell him we'll come back to him in a wee while? So could you just, we're happy for you just to read that out. We haven't all had the benefit to read it this morning, and there may be people watching on Zoom who'd like to hear what you have to say. So you just read it out, that would be great. Thank you.
My overall recommendation on the application remains unchanged to that in my section 42A report, and that I recommend that the application be declined using the discretion provided for in section 1046 of the Resource Management Act 1991, RMA, on the basis of having inadequate information to determine the application. This addendum to my section 42A report presents my revised assessment of the application on the information that I have heard and considered during this hearing. I will address the permitted baseline, effects on cultural values, effects on landscape values, effects on ecology, and effects relating to the anchoring system of the dredge. I will also address the conditions proposed by the applicant and changes to my assessment against Part 2. Is that too loud?
Pardon?
Is that too loud?
No, that's good.
Fine.
Yeah.
Loud's good.
Permitted baseline. Based on information I have heard and considered during this hearing, I am now of the opinion that the permitted baseline under Rule 13.5.1.7 of the Regional Plan Water for Otago is not applicable. With respect to my pre-circulated Section 42A report and Section 42A addendum relating to landscape effects, I relied on the permitted baseline only in relation to effects of the sediment discharge on landscape values. The reason why I have reconsidered this assessment matter is due to the fact that I have come to understand that a permitted activity suction dredge could not physically operate within the part of the river bed in which the applicant seeks to dredge, because the permitted activity dredging activity uses divers and cannot operate in high velocity water. I also consider that there is a significant size difference between the permitted activity suction dredge nozzle, 150mm, and the proposed 350mm, which allows for much greater throughput of gravels. I will address this matter below in relation to how it affects my previous assessment of effects on landscape values presented in my landscape addendum. Effects on cultural values. Mr. Sycamore states in paragraph 38 of his opening statement that it would be helpful if Section 42A authors specified what aspects of cultural values are incomplete, rather than making a broad statement without any context to enable further assessment. I consider that the aspects requiring further assessment were clearly outlined in my Section 42A report, where I state in bold, I recommend that the applicant engages with Ōkaha on this matter prior to hearing of the application being held. In Section 6.1.12a, page 31, relating to Wāhi Tūpuna and Ara Tāwhito values, Section 6.1.12b, page 34, relating to Wai Māori values, and 6.1.12c, page 36, relating to archaeological values. I observe that the applicant has had ample clarity and opportunity to prior to the hearing to engage on these matters and seek, if not resolution, clarity around the position of mana whenua on these matters. Ms. Irvine, in her legal submissions, has made reference to the decision of Wakatu Inc. v Tasman District Council, 2012, New Zealand Environment Court Decision 75. She states that biophysical effects need to be more than minor before concerns about metaphysical effects are engaged and weighed. I have based my assessment of adverse effects on cultural values on the more recent decision of SKP Incorporated v Auckland Council, 2018 Environment Court 81 at 157, which states, quote, persons who hold mana whenua are best placed to identify impacts of the proposal on the physical and cultural environment valued by them, and making submissions about provisions of the Act and findings in relevant case law on these matters. We approve of that approach. This is of importance because the decision explicitly states that it is mana whenua who are best placed to assess the effects of a proposal, and I note that the applicant has attempted to assess cultural values through a Western lens with reference to other expert evidence such as ecology and landscape effects. I also note that the changes to the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, NPS-FM, were made in 2020 after the decision that Ms. Irvine references. The NPS-FM represents a shift in freshwater management, with the first priority being the health and well-being of water bodies and freshwater ecosystems. I also have considered Tauranga Environmental Protection Society Incorporated versus Tauranga City Council 2021 NZHC 1201 at 65, whereby it is open to the decision maker to test and assess the credibility and reliability of this evidence. With respect to this, I've considered where potential effects are unlikely to occur, such as through the species not being located there, or where conditions could manage adverse effects. I understand that Ōkaha consider that there has not been sufficient information provided for them to assess the effects of the proposal on cultural values. I refer to the following provisions of the partially operative regional policy statement and the proposed regional policy statement, which provide some guidance on this matter, and I have considered them when making my assessment below. Policy 5.4.3 of the partially operative regional policy statement, precautionary approach to adverse effects. Apply a precautionary approach to activities where adverse effects may be uncertain, not able to be determined, or poorly understood, but are potentially significant or irreversible. Proposed regional policy statement, IMP6, acting on the best available information. Avoid unreasonable delays in decision-making processes by using the best information available at the time, including but not limited to Mātauraka Māori, local knowledge and reliable partial data. Proposed regional policy statement, IMP15, precautionary approach. Adopt a precautionary approach towards proposed activities whose effects are uncertain, unknown or little understood, but could be potentially significantly adverse, particularly where the areas and values within Otago have not been identified in plans as required by this RPS. I consider that a precautionary approach should be applied as there are uncertainties as to the effects that the proposal will have on cultural values, and that these uncertainties could be further clarified through more in-depth engagement with mana whenua. In the following sections, I provide an update of the assessment of effects presented in my Section 42A report from information that I have heard or not heard during this hearing. Wāhi tūpuna and arata whito values. In my Section 42A report, Section 6.1.12.a, I concluded that there was inadequate information to assess the level of effect on wāhi tūpuna and arata whito values. Mr. Vile states in his evidence that, quote, the proposal does not safeguard the relationship of mana whenua with this significant awa, unquote. He states that the issues of concern for mana whenua in relation to wāhi tāpu and arata whito are clearly expressed in the CIA in submission, which states, quote, inadequate information has been provided to enable mana whenua to assess whether the effects of dredging on wāhi tūpuna and arata whito will be addressed, unquote. Mr. Vile states that these matters were not raised by Mr. Sycamore during the further consultation meeting, nor in the follow-up email. As such, I still have inadequate information to assess the level of effect of the proposal on those values. Why Māori values? In my Section 42A report, Section 6.1.12.b, I concluded that there was inadequate information to assess the level of effect on why Māori values based on the advice in the CIA, which states that, quote, overall, mana whenua are unable to assess whether the proposed dredging activity provides for the mauri of the mata'o and gives effect to Te Mana o Te Wai due to the paucity of information provided in the application, unquote. Ōkaha stated this further in their submission on the application, paragraph 10.6. In the cultural evidence of Mr. Parata, he stated that he believed that the applicant, quote, has applied an inappropriate framework for assessing cultural values and impacts of the proposed activity on cultural values, and misunderstood key concepts including Māori and mihinga kai, unquote. He considers that the proposal does not accord with Waimāori and considers that the proposal could have significant impacts on cultural values, but advised there is inadequate information to complete that assessment. With respect to mihinga kai, Mr. Parata states that the applicant has relied upon overseas studies and there has been no assessment of impact on kanakana and no assessment of impact of the activity on mihinga kai in the mata'o. Mr. Parata, when speaking, advised that there isn't sufficient evidence to say that it will deplete mihinga kai, which is why more evidence is requested. I note that whilst it is the aim of mana whenua to have kanakana reintroduced in this portion of the river, it is my understanding that they are not currently there and as such do not form part of the existing environment, as I have not placed great weight on that specific matter when drawing my conclusion below. With respect to Māori, Mr. Parata states that, quote, a cornerstone for mana whenua in exercising kaitiakitanga in the Mata'o Clutha River is to avoid activities which further degrade the Māori of the river and to seek to improve or restore it, unquote. He considers that putting a dredge in the proposed location where there is not currently a dredge will adversely affect the mode of the river, and acknowledges that the matter for decision is where these effects sit relative to all matters considered under the RMA. Mr. Parata, while speaking, stated that any human activity will affect the mode of the natural processes of the river, but the scale of that effect would depend on the nature and type of the activity. During his submission, Mr. Parata advised that past activities have degraded kaitahu access to the river and its natural resources, and therefore the concern is to minimise any effect that any activity will have on migration, spawning, habitat, connectivity and rehabilitation of the taonga in the area. He spoke to the fact that the way effects on cultural values are assessed is taking information provided by the applicant and studies, etc. In Mr. Parata's opinion, there has not been enough evidence provided to give a good account of what the effects to cultural values would be. Mr. Edwards, in his evidence, raises concern relating to the unquantified risks of noise impact to eel movement, particularly during times of darkness. He considered that a reduction in hours of the operation would go some way to addressing this effect. Mr. Edwards also retained a concern about the potential impact of the health of the eel population from entrainment. Mr. Edwards considers that the artificial removal of macroinvertebrate species from the stream bed does not put the health and well-being of the mata'o first, and the human-induced loss of macroinvertebrate communities from the base of the food web reduces the energy sources available to the rest of the ecosystem and does not support the mode of the river. Mr. Weil, in his planning evidence, considers that the effects of the proposal on the mode of the Clutha River mata'o are uncertain, and a precautionary approach, which he confirmed would be to decline the application for consent, should be taken to give effect to Te Mana o Te Wai and to protect the mode of the river. Mr. Weil also stated that there was insufficient evidence on the effects of dredging on in-stream benthic environments and therefore on tauka species and their survival. Based on the information I have before me, I consider that I still have inadequate information to determine the level of effect on Wai Māori values, including effects on mode and Te Mana o Te Wai. Archaeological values. I understand from Mr. Weil's evidence is that he was concerned regarding the disturbance of potential archaeological values on the banks of the river rather than within the bed of the river. As the dredge operates with a draft of 0.8 metres, it is just the area of the proposed slipway where there will be a disturbance of the riverbanks. Mr. Weil did not identify any specific archaeological site of concern at the proposed slipway location. I have completed a review, 15th November 2023, of the ARC site website hosted by the New Zealand Archaeological Association of the site of the proposed Queensbury slipway. I note that there is a site, G40161, mining tailings, which appears to be in very close proximity to the site of the proposed slipway. However, the attached report states that it is located on the true left bank of the river. The applicant has proposed the inclusion of an accidental discovery protocol to be followed in the event of any discovery of archaeological material. Based on the inclusion of the accidental discovery protocol condition, I consider it would be appropriate to draw the conclusion that adverse effects on archaeological values will be less than minor. Summary of effects on cultural values. In summary, I consider case law directs that mana whenua are best placed to identify the effects of the proposal on cultural values, and that they should be tested by the decision maker to assess credibility and reliability of the evidence. The NPSFM 2020 brought a significant shift in the way that fresh water is to be managed under the RMA, bringing the health and wellbeing of water bodies and freshwater ecosystems to the forefront. Due to the evidence from mana whenua that they do not have adequate information to determine effects on cultural values, I consider that a precautionary approach should be applied. Effect on landscape values. Following my reconsideration of the application of the permitted baseline to this application, as discussed above, I consider that my Section 42A addendum relating to the effects of the proposal on landscape values, dated 13th November 2023, with respect to the effects of the proposed sediment discharge is no longer correct, and I provide an update of my assessment on the effects of the proposal on landscape values here. For reference, I note from Ms Mackenzie's evidence that the Clutha River mata'o outstanding natural feature, ONF, includes very high biophysical values, including water quality, and high aesthetic values, including, quote, intense water colour contrasting surrounding vegetation, unquote. Mr. Denny has advised me through further conversation that if the permitted baseline, which allows for a visible plume of 100 metres, does not exist, then he considers that the plume would be considered a new element and adverse effects on visual effects would be higher than low, which was the level of effect concluded when relying on the permitted baseline. Mr. Denny advised that with the applicant's proposed conditions of consent, condition 5 of the discharge permit, he does not believe that the adverse effects will be low or less. Using the Te Tangi a Te Manu Aotearoa New Zealand Landscape Guidelines, any adverse effect above low would equate to minor, more than minor, or significant. I do not consider at this time that I have sufficient information to determine the level of effect of the proposed sediment discharge on landscape values. I also do not consider that I have enough information to determine whether it is consistent with the policy framework, which requires that adverse effects from mineral extraction on the values that contribute to the significant or outstanding nature are avoided, policy 5.4.8 of the partially operative regional policy statement, and the values that contribute to the natural feature being outstanding are maintained, policy 3.2.4. I note that these are just two policies to provide an example of further assessment required, but there are other applicable provisions that would need to be reassessed. Effects on ecology. I requested that Ms. Barnett review the changes to the conditions proposed by the applicant on behalf of ORC with respect to effects on ecology values. Ms. Barnett advised that the only condition change that she had concerns with was relating to managing adverse effects on birds. There appears to have been a formatting error when the document has been PDF'd, so for clarity, this is referred to as condition 17E of PDF page 4 of the applicant's proposed conditions. Based on the advice of Ms. Barnett, I am not comfortable that the adverse effects on Indigenous birds would be less than minor using the condition proposed by the applicant. I note that this would likely also have flow-on effects to the policy assessment. I have not identified all of the relevant provisions that it might affect due to the timeframes associated with preparing this response, however, am able to do so if requested. If the hearing panel is of the mind to grant the consent, I consider that conditions 18 and 19, proposed in Appendix A of my Section 42A report, should be used to manage adverse effects on Indigenous birds such that they are less than minor. Effects relating to the anchoring system of the dredge. It is noted through the reading of submissions and hearing lay evidence that a lot of concerns relate to health and safety of river users. I acknowledge that these are genuine concerns raised by submitters, and I consider they fall best for consideration under the relevant health and safety legislation, the ORC Navigational Safety Bylaw, and Ms. Royce's assessment on behalf of the District Councils. Conditions. With respect to the applicant's changes to the proposed conditions provided as Appendix A to my Section 42A report, I have the following comments. I note that the applicant is yet to provide their proposed condition outlining how they intend to monitor water clarity and any limits they consider required to meet the requirements of the proposed condition 5 of the discharge permit. I also note that given the potential adverse effects of the discharge on landscape values where the permitted baseline is not relied upon, condition 5 as currently written may not be adequate to manage effects or align with the policy framework.
Just with the table that follows.
Yeah.
With the table that follows, maybe if you just read out the condition number and then your assessment text,
Yeah,
rather than
sounds
the provisions and the conditions themselves.
Okay, so these relate to consent RM 23-43101, the land use consent to disturb the bed of the Clutha River. Condition 17, relating to birds. Based on the advice of Ms. Barnett, I do not consider that this condition will adequately manage effects on Indigenous birds. See Section 4 above. That comment also applies to condition 19 and table 1. Condition 21, relating to the removal of the advertisement from the newspapers. While conditions have been proposed on the District Council consents relating to the installation of signage, I consider it would be beneficial for this condition to remain, even if reduced to an extent to only relate to relevant social media platforms, so the public are aware of any works commencing prior to operation. Condition 22, relating to Ligoro siphon. Based on the advice of Ms. Barnett, I consider that this condition adequately manages the effect of Ligoro siphon. Relating to RM 22-43403, the discharge permit, conditions 5 to 8, relating to the discharge plume As described in section 3, based on the information that I have, I'm unable to determine the level of adverse effect of the proposed discharge on landscape values where the permitted baseline is not applied. As such, this condition may need to be altered to provide for those landscape values. Part 2 of the Act. In this section, I present only the differences to my section 42A report. Section 5, I consider that there is inadequate information to assess effects on cultural values and landscape values. As such, an assessment cannot be completed as to whether the proposal will sustain the potential of natural and physical resources to meet the reasonably foreseeable needs of future generations, or whether the life-supporting capacity of the water will be safeguarded. Section 6A, the preservation of the natural character of rivers and their margins and protection of them from inappropriate subdivision use and development. I consider that further information is required to determine whether the proposal would provide for the preservation of the natural character of the Clutha River Mata O from inappropriate use and development. Section 6B, I consider that, the protection of outstanding natural features from inappropriate subdivision use and development. I consider that further information is required to determine whether the proposal would provide for the protection of the Clutha River Mata O outstanding natural feature from inappropriate use and development. Section 7C, the maintenance and enhancement of amenity values. I consider that further information is required to determine whether the proposal would provide for the maintenance and enhancement of amenity values of the Clutha River Mata O. Recommendation. Section 1046 provides discretion for the consent authority to decline an application on the grounds that it has inadequate information to determine the application. I consider there is inadequate information on the effects of the proposal on cultural values with respect to Waihi Tūpuna, Aratawhito values and Waimāori values, including Māori, and whether the proposal gives effect to Te Mana o Te Wai, and inadequate information on the effects of the proposal on landscape values of the Clutha River Mata O outstanding natural feature with respect to the discharge of sediment. Due to the effects of the proposal on cultural values and landscape values being unclear, and a flow on inability to assess consistency with the provisions of several of the relevant documents, I consider there is inadequate information to make a determination on the application. As such, I recommend the application should be declined using discretion provided for in section 1046.
Excellent, thank you very much for that. I'll see if we have questions for you, Jane. Any questions?
I just had one. If you could just remind me what your conclusion was on your assessment of the National Policy Statement Freshwater, and if that's changed.
Yes, so my conclusion on that was that there was inadequate information to determine consistency, and my opinion on that has not changed.
Okay. And that links back to the sole objective of ensure. I think the wording is ensure. Take a look at that for me. Ensure, and then the first priority is health and well-being.
Yeah, go.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, so there are a number of provisions in the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management that I consider that there is inadequate information to assess whether the proposal aligns with them. That includes the objective and policies 1, 2, 5, and 15.
Thank you. That was all I had.
Craig? Okay, just while Commissioner Welsh is just finding his relevant document, just if Ms Barnett is going to provide us with a written outline of what she conveyed to us this morning, can you ask her to add to that to specify why she's unhappy with the conditions proposed by the applicant to protect Indigenous birds?
Yes, we've have got that response prepared in relation to the birds as well.
Great, thank you. So you already have that response from her?
Yes, this morning, yep.
Okay. So we can have that provided to us now then, couldn't we?
Yes, I can read it out.
Yeah, you can read. How long is it?
Quite short.
Yeah, if you could read that out, and then we can get that in writing as well.
Regarding avifauna, no detail has been provided on species presence and threat status. With respect to paragraphs 20 to 21 of Mr. Hamer's evidence, effects on avifauna, needs to state that they are native or indigenous birds, not endemic birds. They're two different things. Avoidance of the most likely nesting areas has already been shown through the dredging exclusion zones. Identifying the likely gravel areas, beaches that species would breed is appropriate, but there is no allowance for native birds that use trees for nesting, e.g. shags, and she has included a snip of observations in the area. 250 metre exclusion zone is excessive. For example, on construction sites with dotterels, we have a 50 metre exclusion zone and a 45 metre flight initiated disturbance zone was calculated for at-risk or threatened coastal birds for Northport. With respect, she's also provided comment with respect to the condition. Would you like me to read that as well? Yep. Condition 17 regarding birds needs to be a separate condition of consent, not included under fish entrainment. Removal of the Australasian crested grebe as they only nest in lakes, not riverbeds and outwashes. This is a very specific list and should be verified if it is to protect all indigenous birds. Note, southern black-backed gull is only one of a few native birds not protected under the Wildlife Act and is managed, so could be excluded from this list. I don't think added the pest traps are necessary and nice to have, particularly if they are avoiding breeding grounds and therefore effects are negligible. 250 metre exclusion zone is very large. NZTA uses 50 metres and Northport has 45 metre zone based on the considerable literature at the highest mean flight initiation distance for threatened and at-risk New Zealand birds. In accordance with the zone proposed by the applicant, the condition should include: following the breeding native bird surveys, a suitably qualified and experienced ecologist must report that either no breeding of native birds are identified from the survey and works may proceed, or breeding native birds are identified and therefore a 250 metre works exclusion zone shall apply, within which no works are to occur until such time that a suitably qualified and experienced ecologist has confirmed that any nests have failed or chicks have naturally fledged the natal site.
So my take on that is that she actually thinks the recommended conditions are overly onerous in general, other than perhaps the effect on birds nesting in trees.
That might be a question for her.
That would be.
Yep.
She's still there?
Is Trish still online?
Okay, if we can get her back online at some stage before we adjourn this morning, then we'll just have some further questions for her on that. Right, Craig, any further questions?
Just a general question. Your addendum 1 had some analysis on landscape values, and your conclusion was that I consider the outstanding natural feature being the river will be protected and the proposal is not an appropriate use of the riverbed. Addendum number 2 supersedes that, and are you willing to strike out that statement? Yeah, I mean, does that override that statement in addendum 1?
Yes, fully overrides addendum 1.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you. And the last thing was top of page, there's no page numbers, but section 4, you outline that you'd be able to, the flow-on effects in terms of the bird assessment on you could identify the policies that would be relevant. If you could please provide those, that would be helpful.
Yes, can do.
Thank you.
No, nothing further from me.
All right, here we got Mr. Denny up and running.
Hello.
Sounds like he's
At the end of a tunnel.
a long way away.
Mr. Denny, are you online? Yes, can you hear us? Can you hear us, Mr. Denny? It would appear not by the look of confusion on Mr. Denny's face. All right, so we need a plan B for Mr. Denny. Was Mr. Denny going to present to us or simply answer questions?
Answer questions.
All right, so what we will do is put our questions in writing to Mr. Denny and he can answer in writing. All right, so that's the end of that technical glitch. All right, I think that brings us to the end of ORC presentation, apart from getting Ms. Barnett back online. Tamsin, are you able to contact her and see when she might be able to come back on?
Yeah, I thought we've done quite well until then.
Looking at someone's face. So just while Tamsin's waiting to, trying to contact Ms. Barnett. So Ms. Royce, are you online?
Yes, I am. Yes, I am.
Excellent. So what I'm going to suggest we do is, good morning and welcome. Hope hope you're feeling well. What we might
As
do,
well as can be.
yeah, understood. So what we might do is maybe Tamsin's just trying to get Ms. Barnett back online. So what we might do is break early for a cup of tea, and then we'll hear from you and just ask you to read out your report to us, and then we can go through that without a break and deal with any questions rather than breaking for morning tea halfway through your presentation.
Okay.
If that's okay with you. Yep.
Yep.
So we'll adjourn now, and we'll come back either when we have Ms. Barnett online or when we hear from you. And then Tamsin will let you know when that is, but it'll probably be in 15, 20 minutes' time.
Thank you.
All right. So we'll adjourn for now, and we'll come back in a short period of time.
statement. Yeah, I mean, does it override that statement in the addendum?
Yes, fully overrides addendum.
Thank you.
All right, good morning again, everyone. We'll resume the hearing, and I understand we have Ms Barnett back online. Is that the case? So, Ms Barnett, can you hear us?
Yes, thank you. I just rebooted so I could, because I couldn't hear you to start off with.
Excellent, thank you. Just following Ms Barrow's presentation, we just asked if we could have you back just to gain some clarity from you on your overall opinion of the effects of the proposal on Indigenous birds. Ms Barrow's read out the email that you had provided to her, which we now have a copy of, and my comment on hearing that was it seemed to me that, if anything, you thought the proposed conditions were overly onerous, apart from effects on birds nesting in trees, and we thought we'd just bring you back just to confirm that, if that is the case, and just what your overall opinion is on the effects of the proposal on Indigenous birds. If you could address that for us, please.
Okay, I think that the exclusion zone is overly onerous. I think 250 metres, I'm not even sure where that initially came from. I presume it came from the applicant at an earlier stage of the assessments. But as I said in my my written comments, NZTA uses 50 metres for dotterels, which are an at-risk, which is a TAR species, a threatened and at-risk species. And Northport went through considerable effort and to identify when birds start flying, and so it's called a flight initiation distance. And they came out with a 45-metre exclusion zone for, and this is for works in vicinity of known nests. So that was more a comment to Otago Regional Council, just to add some perspective on that. If they want to have a 250-metre exclusion zone, that's well and good, but that's well past any level of disturbance that would cause flight initiation or birds to leave their nest. Saying that, I did have an issue with there wasn't actually a good avifauna section in the report, and there wasn't a full assessment of what birds were expected to be on site. So that was my first impression of the reporting and the consent, and that we had a look through eBird, which provides records of what is known in the area, and we use that to sort of give some guidance. But that's that's something that the applicant should be actually doing, providing that full assessment of what birds are expected on site, what their threatened status is, and whether they expect them to be within the proximity of the area that the dredge is going to be used, and then the condition of consent should be applied. So to answer your question, I think that the condition of consent is not onerous enough in some respects and overly onerous in others. So poorly drafted, maybe.
Yes, so we just need to drill into that a little bit further. So in terms of the not onerous enough element, what's that?
We need a clear idea of exactly what birds are there. Some of the birds listed in the condition of consent won't be present. They won't be nesting there because they are they breed on lakes, not in rivers. And so, that was the crested grebe, for example.
Yeah.
The shags aren't included in the list, and they're known to be in the area. So those are the sort of things, that's the sort of information that I would have expected to have found as part of the assessment on birds. And I suppose what I would have expected to have is have the birds, they're at risk, or threat status, the likelihood of them being on site, their breeding season, and where they're breeding. So there was like a really clear indication of what we expected to find in the area and whether the dredging would have had any, are likely to have any effects on those birds. Saying that, going all the way back again, that there has been an effort to avoid, just completely avoid areas that I would look at as being, primary target areas for those surveys. So what we're looking at is like the residual areas.
All right, thank you for that. Any follow-up questions?
Oh, just a clarification. Was that information ever requested through further information requests?
Sorry, could you just speak up?
Sorry,
Was
that information ever requested through Section 92 request for further information?
I don't think so. What we ended up, I can't say. I can have a look and see if it was. I don't think it was requested at that level.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Ms. Barnett. Thanks for coming back on and answering our questions on birds.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And sorry, Tamsin, just a request for you. What we're going to do is, prior to us departing today, prepare a few questions for Mr. Denny in writing, and we'll forward them through to you. So he'll be getting those around midday today. And so if he could respond before the end of the day in writing back to you, that would be great. Yeah, thank you. All right, Kirsten Royce, back online. Yes, good morning again. So now we're at the stage of the hearing where we hear from you, and I think, as outlined this morning, it'd be really helpful for us and anyone who's watching on Zoom if you could just proceed to read out your end of hearing report to us, please, and then we'll see if we have questions for you.
Okay, thank you. Oh, it looks like I've got a bit of a lag here from my end, so I hope you can hear me okay.
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Great, thank you. In reviewing my recommendation, I've taken into account the evidence presented by the applicant and submitters, the questions from the panel and the responses, and the legal submissions at the applicant's counsel. In terms of activity status, I accept the legal advice of Ms. Irving and provide, as supported by relevant case law, and agree that the proposal should be assessed as a discretionary activity overall. In terms of definitions, development, in my response to minute 3, I advised that development was not defined in the relevant planning instruments. I note that I omitted the QLPDP definition of subdivision and development. This definition means subdivision, identification of building platforms, any buildings and associated activities such as roading, earthworks, lighting, landscaping, planting and boundary fencing, and accessing gateway structures. In my reading of the definition, development in terms of subdivision and development, the activities referred to are related to buildings and building platforms and do not seem relevant to the activity subject to this application. However, I also note in the QLPDP objectives and policies and in the drafting of these that the phrasing generally refers to subdivision use and development, which would suggest that these may be intended to include development which is other than subdivision and development as defined. For completeness, there's no standalone definition of subdivision in the QLPDP either. I note Ms. Irving suggests development may mean change, although may provide additional submissions on this. In my everyday understanding, development will be more appropriately assessed as changing from one state to another or the process of converting land to a new purpose. In terms of this proposal, there appears to be no conversion of land occurring, and any changes associated with the proposal are not enduring, i.e. the proposal does not develop the land into something else. For these reasons, I have treated the proposal as a land use activity only rather than a development activity. Temporary activities. In lieu of any helpful direction from case law, I consider that the effects will be temporary and not enduring at any given location. This approach is supported by the evidence of Ms McKenzie and Mr Denny. That said, I agree with Ms Irving that despite effects being deemed temporary, this does not mean that effects are to be disregarded, and I advise that these must be considered in terms of the sensitivity of receivers and the duration of exposure. Structure. In terms of the definition of structure, I note Ms Irving is intending to provide her interpretation of this to the panel. Mr Sycamore may also have an opinion on the definition of structure, which may be helpful to the panel. In my assessment, I note the QLPDP definition, structure means any building, equipment, device or other facility made by people and which is fixed to land and includes any raft. Boat means any vessel, appliance, equipment used or designed to be used for flotation or navigation on or through the water surface other than a wetsuit or life jacket, and includes any aircraft whilst such aircraft is on the surface of water. Craft and boating craft have the same meaning. For completeness, raft is referenced in the structure definition, is not defined in the QLPDP, and neither is mooring. In my opinion, the dredge meets the definition of boat as set out above and as stated in the application is reasonably identified as a maritime vessel. I took guidance from Rule 21.15.8 in the QLPDP, which governs both moorings and structures. Moorings and structures are identified as separate activities within the rule, and in my reading, the two activities are independent, i.e. a mooring or a structure. I have identified that 21.15.8 is triggered by the application. That said, I note potentially a mooring could be interpreted to be a structure because it's technically fixed to land. But in my opinion, if this was the case, there would be no need for Rule 21.15.8 to reference both structures and moorings, as the term structure would be all-encompassing. If the panel were to determine a mooring was a structure, I consider this does not automatically infer that the boat must also be treated as a structure. I'm unaware of any QLDC consents which require boats to be treated as structures when they are at anchor or moored, for example, at a marina. However, should the panel treat the mooring as a structure, then I consider that any assessment of the mooring structure would be limited to the effects of the mooring line only. For completeness, I note the discussion through the course of the hearing and in line with proposed condition 13, and I just note that should actually be condition 12A, the mooring lines will be submerged. In this regard, I expect that any adverse visual landscape effects to be very limited. The effects of the mooring or structure on navigation are discussed later in this review. Large-scale mineral extraction. Large-scale mineral extraction is not defined in the QLPDP. However, I continue to be of the opinion that the proposal would not be defined as a large-scale mineral extraction development for the following reasons. The operation involves a single dredge operating over a 22-kilometre area. The effects of the proposal are largely assessed as transient, localised and temporary. There are no enduring effects which would require rehabilitation. In my assessment of the scale of the proposal, I have also referenced the proposal against my experience and involved in the Macraes Gold Mine Coronation North Pit extension, along with other small and large-scale quarrying and mining activities which I monitored over a 2-year period as a senior planner at Dunedin City Council. In terms of the permitted baseline, I consider that there is no helpful permitted baseline within either the CODP or the QLPDP that provides for a dredge which is 24 metres in length, 6.6 metres wide, with a height of approximately 3.5 to 4.5 metres, and a maximum height of 7.5 metres with the inclusion of roof appendages. I agree with the applicant that there are permitted activity rules which will provide for such and dredge mining activities of a lesser scale. However, I also note that the exclusive mining permits held by the applicant means that the occurrence of other permitted such and dredge within the stretch of river could be construed as fanciful, i.e. I consider it unlikely that the applicant would operate 14 6-inch dredges within the QLDC jurisdiction as proposed in the application for RM 22834. That said, I note that the applicant is also intending to provide the panel with further information on this. I also consider that even if there were 14 dredges spaced some 500 metres apart and which complied with the QLPDP and ORC permitted activity conditions, this cumulative activity would lead to quite different landscape and visual effects. In making this assessment, I have been guided by the evidence of Mr. Denny. In response to the panel's questions of Mr. Kenderdine, I have included the images included in the AEE by the applicant for RM 220834, which may help to demonstrate the difference in scale between what type of suction dredge is permitted by the ORC and QLPDP rules and what is being proposed. It is my opinion that the scale of the two are not comparable. I accept that providing the applicant complies with the permitted noise standards, then noise generation will fall within the permitted baseline. However, I note the applicant's offer of an expert noise assessment to establish compliance with the permitted activity standards, given that there is no expert evidence before the panel which confirms compliance with these standards at this time. I also note that the applicant has promoted or agreed to the inclusion of noise standards as conditions of consent, and if imposed, then the applicant is required to operate within those limits and would not be able to operate if the noise limits cannot be met. Noise effects. Further to the permitted baseline for noise, I note the applicant's offer of expert noise assessment. While I agree with the submitters that an expert noise assessment should ideally be presented before any consent is granted, I accept that the applicant intends to make changes to the dredge which are expected to reduce noise generation effects. In this regard, I agree with the applicant that any noise assessment will be premature at this time. I recognise the submitter's evidence of Dr. Duxon, Mr. Kenderdine and Mr. Benjamin, and also note Ms. Marsh, regarding the low ambient noise levels, but consider these and the effect the proposed activity will have on these are more reasonably evaluated by a qualified and experienced noise expert. In considering the applicant's proposed noise assessment condition and the concerns of submitters, I additionally recommend a review condition be included in any suite of conditions should consent be granted, which would consider additional exclusion zones, especially in regard of sensitive receivers, depending on the findings of the noise assessment, landscape assessment. Also following on from the permitted baseline assessment, I note Mr. Denny's landscape peer review assessment notes the permitted baseline but does not rely on this in undertaking his effects assessment. He notes at paragraph 31 of his review that the landscape report assessment places weight on permitted activities, but I consider the difference in scale of activity between permitted and proposed is underestimated. I agree that the landscape report that the proposal I disagree with the landscape report that the proposal presents an alternative configuration and intensification of an activity that is reasonably anticipated. The degree of upscaling of size of intake and corresponding scale of vessel to a permitted activity is proportionately large. It also appears through questions asked of Ms. McKenzie by the panel that if the permitted baseline relied upon in her assessment is set to one side, then this may undermine or further influence her assessment. I recognise Dr. Duxon and Mr. Kenderdine's assessment of landscape effects on their properties, but defer to the expert assessment of Mr. Denny in making my assessment. As noted in my Section 42A supplementary report, I continue to prefer Mr. Denny's assessment and continue to recommend his conditions be included should consent be granted, and in particular, the recommended occupation restrictions in respect to the viewpoints from residential dwellings. I agree with submitters that Mr. Sycamore did not provide evidence to support his evaluation of the likely numbers of users at the Mata'ao Scenic Reserve. However, even if Mr. Sycamore's assumption on the number of users is correct, it is because this reserve has a high degree of natural character and a feeling of seclusion that Mr. Denny recommends an exclusion zone along the reserve boundary to protect these values. I continue to support the inclusion of the exclusion zone condition in respect of the reserve should consent be granted. One point that I would also like to highlight is that the values which contribute to the ONF also include cultural and spiritual values for tangata whenua. Neither Mr. Denny or Ms Mackenzie have presumed to make an assessment of those particular values and instead have restricted their assessments to landscape character, visual effects and effects on natural character. As discussed below, I consider the effects on cultural values to remain unresolved at this time. Cultural values. With regard to the questions asked by the panel regarding any reference to statutory acknowledgement within the QLPDP, I advise that Part 5.8 of the Tangata Whenua chapter in the QLPDP sets out the Ngāi Tahu Claim Settlement Act 1998 cultural redress provisions and recognises that these are given practical effect through statutory acknowledgement, nohanga and tupuni. The Clutha River Mata'ao is identified as a statutory acknowledgement within this section of the plan. In terms of effects on cultural values, the Clutha River Mata'ao is identified as a wahi tupuna, which is identified in the QLPDP as landscapes and places that embody the relationship of Ngāi Tahu, their culture, traditions, and their ancestral lands, water sites, wahi tapu, and other tonga. The term refers to places that hold the respect of the people in accordance with tikanga. I refer to my comments at point 13 in my response to minute 3, dated 8th of November 2023, which recognises the need for an assessment of the proposal against mana whenua values, including mahika kai, wai, wahi tapuna, and adverse effects on activities taken within the riparian margins and on the surface of water. I note the cultural values are a consideration in terms of assessing the effects on the ONF. Ms Irving has identified case law to support the applicant's position in terms of cultural values. The cited cases are dated between 2006 and 2016. It might be helpful for the panel to have Ms Irving provide more context as to the relevance of the findings of these cases, especially given the paradigm shift to Te Mana o Te Wai for freshwater management. I agree with Mr Vile that in terms of the MPSFW, identification of the fundamental concept of Te Mana o Te Wai at 1.35, there is a hierarchy of obligations in Te Mana o Te Wai that prioritises first the health and well-being of water bodies and freshwater ecosystems, second the health needs of people such as drinking water, and third the ability of people and communities to provide for their social, economic, cultural well-being now and in the future. Mr Parata advises that Te Mana o Te Wai is not a traditional Ngāi Tahu whānui concept, nor a framework to assess the impact of the proposed activity on Ngāi Tahu cultural values. Mr Parata suspects that the proposal could have significant impacts on cultural values, but considers that there is insufficient evidence to make a full assessment of these effects. Mr Parata highlights connectivity, migration, rehabilitation impacts on tonga to the areas as particular matters of concern. All ka runaka presenters considered that the applicant has not established that the proposal will not have adverse effects on the Māori of the Clutha River Mata'ao. I'm afraid I'm no further advanced in my assessment of cultural values after listening to the evidence presented by legal counsel, Mr Sycamore and ka runaka submitters. I do not consider that ka runaka have invoked a right of veto on the application. Rather, I accept their position that they have insufficient information on which to make a robust assessment. That said, I consider there is a pathway forward for the applicant to sufficiently identify or address effects on cultural values to provide a level of comfort to ka runaka, and this includes effects on tonga species and habitat, including spawning habitats and migration pathways. Mr Parata notes that the effects on tonga species are likely to equate to adverse effects on cultural values. I also consider that ka runaka are the best place to make this assessment. Effects on river users. In terms of the evidence which the panel could reasonably rely on regarding numbers of recreational water users, kayakers, canoeists, floaters, swimmers, I could not source any specific data on the numbers for the stretch of river. In particular, the Otago Harbour Master confirmed that they do not collect data on this. And unfortunately, I have not been able to contact the QLDC Harbour Master during the hearing, as one is on annual leave and the other one is out of the office. Even if regional data on recreational water users could be sourced, I suspect that this would not be particularly helpful in its applicability to this particular stretch of river. given that Queenstown Lakes and Central Otago are renowned for high recreational opportunities offered by a range of water bodies within the two regions, and data collected would likely cover all of these opportunities. Therefore, I consider that extrapolating any regional data to apply to the specific area would not be robust or reliable. I recognise the submitters who have provided anecdotal evidence of a moderate to high recreational use for the stretch of Grade 2 river. I also recognise the concerns raised by the submitters regarding the mooring lines and hazards these may pose to recreational users. Submitted evidence today presented which suggests that the dredge has not been operated as safely as it could have been to date. In making my assessment of effects on recreational users, and in particular with regard to navigational safety, I relied on the advice of the QLDC Harbour Master, whose main concerns was that the operation did not pose a health and safety risk to other water users and did not impede access for other river users. I generally adopted the conditions of the Harbour Master that the Harbour Master recommended. In doing so, I considered that this would ensure that the adverse navigational safety effects arising from the dredge operation would be adequately mitigated or avoided. After reviewing the animation prepared by Mr. Anthony O'Howe Ward Holmes, dredge at Lugga animation, I have concerns regarding the degree of risk introduced by the movement of the cable through the water column and how compliance with condition 12A would reasonably be achieved by the applicant. As noted above, I have not been able to contact the QLDC Harbour Master during the hearing. I request time to confirm with the QLDC Harbour Master that the proposed anchoring system, as shown in the diagrams prepared by Mr. Hall and the animation by Mr. Ward Holmes, are as the Harbour Master assumed, and that the applicant's proposed change to condition 12A below continues to give effect to the Harbour Master's intent. And that's condition 12A, where the bed is struck out of riverbed. While I continue to support the inclusion of the conditions promoted by the QLDC Harbour Master and note the applicant's general acceptance of these, the evidence presented at the hearing has raised additional concerns with me in respect of the risk posed to other water users by the mooring system, the maintenance of free movement of other water users, and the applicant's ability to comply with condition 12A, modified or not. After reviewing the evidence presented at the hearing and without gaining further advice from the QLDC Harbour Master, I currently do not have confidence that the proposal will ensure the safety and efficiency of navigation will be maintained on the river, and that the public access along the rivers will be maintained and enhanced. Any further modifications to the safe and courteous operation of the dredge in respect of other river users offered by the applicant would also be welcomed. Cumulative effects. I note the changes promoted by questions to the panel to Mr. Sycamore led to a potential offer of a condition which would ensure that the current consents held by the applicant for the lower reaches of the river would not be exercised concurrently with the applied for consents should these be granted. I support the inclusion of this condition and consider it would lend weight to Mr. Sycamore's assessment of cumulative effects. Given the exclusivity of the mining permits held by the applicant, and for similar reasons set out in my permitted baseline assessment, I consider that there is a low risk of cumulative effects of simultaneous such and dredge mining operations in the river, which would lead to a cumulative effect. Archaeological sites. As noted, I continue to support the evidence of Mr. Denny and his recommended conditions, with the exception of the archaeological condition as discussed below. And I've just set out that condition there.
Yep.
I've considered Mr. Sycamore's advice that the identified archaeological site is located some distance from the slipway works. However, Mr. Sycamore also recognises that not all archaeological sites are known or identified. To address this, the applicant has offered an accidental discovery protocol condition. I continue to support the inclusion of this in the draft suite of conditions. As part of that condition, the applicant will be required to stop work should archaeological material be discovered during the works to form the slipway, and if required, the archaeological authority would need to be sought. I consider that the continued inclusion of this condition is likely to address the concerns raised by Mr. Denny. Cycleway consents. I could not find any record for an application made to CODC, QLDC or ORC by Southern Lakes Trails Trust for the proposed cycleway identified in Dr. Duxon, Mr. Kenderdine and Ms. Marsh's submissions. This would be consistent with Mr. Kenderdine's advice that resource consent for the application of the cycle trail has not been made at this time. While I acknowledge the degree of engagement Southern Lakes Trail Trust has apparently undertaken with the surrounding property owners, as outlined by Mr. Kenderdine and Ms. Marsh, it is my opinion that the cycle trail is not part of the consented environment and therefore cannot be considered as part of the receiving environment. Paragraph 41 of Ms. Mackenzie's evidence. I've been directed by the panel to consider the list of CODP objectives and policies identified at paragraph 41 of Ms. Mackenzie's evidence. In my supplementary section 42A report in respect of landscape, I have included an assessment of the relevant objectives and policies which I considered to be relevant to landscape. In addition to those objectives and policies identified by Ms. Mackenzie, I also include an assessment of objective that should be 4.3.2 and policy 4.4.1, which, despite the river not specifically being identified as an ONL or ONF within the CODC jurisdiction, I considered needed to be addressed in light of the values attributed to the river by Mr. Denny and Ms. Mackenzie. I also provide an assessment of policy 4.2, which was landscape and amenity values, and objective 4.3.6, margins of water bodies, and policy 4.4.4, riparian margins. Comment on objective 21.2.5. I could not find any reference to the objective 21.2.15 in the QLPDP. However, Mr. Sycamore and I do appear to differ on what has been assessed for objective 2.25. In the AEE for RM 220834, objective 21.2.5 is set out as mineral extraction opportunities are provided for on the basis of location, scale and effects, which would not degrade amenity, water, wetlands, landscape and Indigenous biodiversity values. I can confirm that objective 21.2.5 as set out in the Consolidated Decisions chapter of the QLPDP is as follows. Prospecting, exploration and mineral extraction opportunities are provided for on the basis that the location, scale and effects will protect, maintain or restore rural amenity, water, wetlands, landscape and Indigenous biodiversity values. Conditions. I'm largely comfortable with the changes to the suite of conditions as amended by Ms. Irving. However, I make the following comments. I note, with the exception of new condition 18 relating to the duration of occupancy of the dredge of the river within 1 kilometre for any visible rural dwelling from the river that's accessed from Multi-Point Road and associated side roads and the River Ridge Road and any associated side roads, no other condition proposed by Mr. Denny have been adopted by the applicant. I continue to support the evidence of Mr. Denny and his recommended conditions with the exception of the archaeological condition discussed above. In terms of introduced condition 10.1, which introduces a clause to notify any other party who requests to be notified of the dredge location, I consider that it would be helpful for the applicant to consider how this would practically occur. How would a river user know that this was an option? How would these users make contact? And how would this be recorded and implemented, etc.? I also question the applicant's ability to comply with condition 12A, modified or not, in light of the evidence presented by the submitters. I support the inclusion requiring a 5 metre setback from the fuel hose to the riverbank, on the proviso that all other safety procedures and safeguards as identified in the application are in place. I recognise and support the offer by Mr. Sycamore of a condition which ensure that current consents held by the applicant for the lower reaches of the river would not be exercised concurrently with the applied for consents. As noted previously, I also support the inclusion of a review condition in respect of noise effects and other potential exclusion zones following an expert noise assessment. I'm happy to review any revised conditions prepared by the applicant as part of its right of reply. ORC recommendations. As noted in my Section 42A report and subsequent addendums, given the joint nature of this application, I deferred the assessment of water quality and ecology and requested to review the ORC officer's assessment to confirm my support of this or otherwise. By relying on the ORC assessment in terms of ecology and water quality, this is intended to avoid a duplication of function while still ensuring the activity meets the policy framework for the QLPDP and CODC. While I'm comfortable with the conclusions reached to date by Ms Burrows in her Section 42A assessment in terms of water quality and ecology, I note my written review has been prepared prior to the presentation of, sorry, that was Mr Barnett, but it should be Ms Barnett, and the review of Ms Burrow to the panel. Should Ms Burrow and Ms Barnett continue to be comfortable with the ecological and water quality effects of the proposal, are acceptable subject to any conditions, and I consider that the proposal is expected to sit well within the corresponding QLPDP and CODC policy framework as this is relevant to water quality and ecology. Recommendation. In terms of my assessment and recommendations for my Section 42A report, as modified or expanded upon in my response to Minute 3 and supplementary Section 42A report landscape, these largely stand, except for an additional concern regarding navigational safety. In review, I generally accept the draft suite of conditions circulated by the applicant at the beginning of the hearing. There should be a full stop there, and then I support the changes to the conditions as set out in paragraph 60 to 66 of this review, but I seek further clarification on conditions 10I and 12A. I note the proposed noise assessment offered by the applicant and the offered conditions to comply with the noise standards for each district in my recommended review condition, which will provide for additional exclusion zones should these be necessary. I consider with the inclusion of these would address the noise effects concerns that I identified in my Section 42A report. I continue to support the conditions recommended by Mr Denny, except for the condition relating to archaeology, which is addressed by the current accidental discovery protocol condition. At this time, I also support the recommendations of the ORC Section 42A planner in terms of water quality and ecology. I highlight an additional concern regarding navigational safety and public access along the river, identified through the evidence of submitters, which will need to be resolved. I request that the panel allow some time before the applicant submits their right of reply for further comment to be sought from the QL Harbour Master. I still consider there is insufficient evidence to make an assessment that the effects on cultural values are acceptable with any confidence and that consent is able to be granted. Overall, I continue to recommend to decline the application unless cultural values are able to be fully assessed, and additionally that navigational safety concerns are able to be adequately resolved.
Right, thank you very much for that. How much time do you anticipate you will need to be able to confer further with the QLDC Harbour Master?
I would hope that that would be able to be done by Monday, Tuesday next week. He's back on holiday on Monday.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
All right, we'll see if we have any questions for you, Jane.
Just wanted to thank you for your response. You've answered a number of questions that I had. Just wanted to ask you on, we received an attachment yesterday about sort of an update to the Southern Lakes Trail, and from my reading of it was that the number of easements have been granted, and I just wondered what your advice would be to us in terms of easements have been granted but no consents have been applied. Does that change your opinion in terms of the receiving environment?
Not particularly, because if consent's required, it still needs to go through a public process, and in my experience, those cycle trails are often never straightforward through the consenting process. So there could be required to be modifications or otherwise to what they're proposing.
Thank you. And the last question was paragraph 20, you talk about relying on the advice from Mr. Denny on cumulative effects. Has he provided anything to you that we haven't seen? We were unable to talk to him today. I was just wondering if that was a conversation that we've seen his response to a question that the chair asked. Is that a conversation that's occurred since then? Is there anything on cumulative effects?
No, I haven't had any specific conversation with him, although I do know that Ms. Burrows has had some conversation regarding the application of the permitted baseline in terms of the sediment discharge.
Right.
And that if the permitted baseline in that regard, so I should have clarified that Mr. Denny did rely on the permitted baseline in terms of sediment plume and noise.
Right.
And rather, but in my assessment, I was focusing more on the bulk and form of the dredge. And Ms. Burrows has had some further conversation about the applicability of the sediment plume permitted baseline and how that would influence Mr. Denny's assessment.
Okay. Yeah, my question for you was based on the bulk and form and if there had been any discussions on cumulative effects with the permitted baseline or without the permitted baseline further to what we have seen. If there was anything new that you had. Okay, thank you. That was all I had.
Great.
Thank you for reading that evidence. It was very, very concise and clear. Just one question on your supplementary 42A report dated 13th of November, paragraph 76. And it also applies to other references throughout that supplementary evidence. With respect to natural character,
Just wait till she finds
Just 76, did you say?
paragraph 76.
Yes.
When you refer to natural character being of a temporary, any effects on natural character being of a temporary nature, is that only with respect to landscape and visual aspects?
Yes. The supplementary report was solely focused on landscape effects. Yes.
Recognising there's a large number of other matters that fall under the natural character classification. Yep. Okay.
Including tangata whenua values.
Sure. Thank you. In your response to minute 3,
Yes.
just wanted to check whether or not you whether or not, in your opinion, the activities on the surface of the water is a Section 6D matter? That the recreational activities along the river surface are a Section 6D matter? Section 6D states the maintenance and enhancement of public access to and along the rivers. So I just wanted to see whether or not you thought along the rivers applied to surface water activities and that it was a Section 6D matter.
Yes, I do consider along the river does mean not just along the riverbank, but actually along the river itself. I know in the AEE for both RM 220834 and RC 2208225 that the application states specifically that there will be no impediment to river users and minimum risk to other vessels when it's talking about deploying the anchoring system. So when I had made that original assessment, I did consider that there wouldn't, based on the evidence or the assessment from the harbour master, I considered that there wouldn't be any impediment. However, that is now I'm now questioning that based on some of the evidence that I had seen, especially from Mr. Wardholmes.
Okay. I think you answered it quite succinctly with a yes along the surface of the water, so thank you.
Okay.
And the evidence that you just read, I've just got a few questions. Paragraph 40, you've responded to our request for additional data on surface water activities, which I thank you for. Could that have been addressed by a survey prior to the application? The applicant carrying out a survey prior to the application?
Yes, it could have. And I consider that sort of evidence would be something that the applicant, would be responsible for providing. That said, it was not specifically requested for under Section 92.
Okay, thank you. Paragraph 49. I raised the issue during the hearing about relinquishing consents for the downstream activity versus upstream, and the answer was that there could be a condition included which you've referred to. I just wondered what the vires of that condition would be, because that would be fettering the discretion for another consent to actually occur, whether it would be tidier to actually relinquish the original consent downstream. So it's a vires question.
Potentially, it was offered by the applicant. So in that regard, if that was something they were comfortable with, then I wouldn't see it of being too much concern. Obviously, if they surrender that condition, then that makes the vires question moot, doesn't it? If they surrender it.
That's right. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And with respect to the cycleway consents, if we were to consider they weren't part of the existing environment as stated in your approach in paragraph 54 and 55, we could still consider those under 1041C as another matter, couldn't we?
I believe so, but until they're secured, they do not exist. So, in terms of the current receiving environment, then you can consider them. Potentially you could consider them as part of a future environment, but there is a degree of unknown about that, because you're not sure if consent will be granted or what the final form of those cycleways would look like, notwithstanding any existing easements.
So it's a question of weight, isn't it? With respect to that, how far down the track is it? How much weight should we give to that matter?
That's right, and I note that there are no applications lodged. It's not as if there was an application where you were able to have consider what the route is, what the effects are, and whether it's likely to be granted.
Okay, thank you for that. I've got no further questions.
Ms Royce, just one question from me. Your Para 69, you noted your review was prepared prior to hearing from Ms Barnett and Ms Burrows. We've now heard from them, so is there anything you'd like to add in response to that?
No, I support where Ms Burrows has concluded. We have quite similar views, especially in terms of cultural values. In terms of, we both consider that there's insufficient evidence. In terms of ecology and water quality, then yeah, I'm comfortable with Ms Burrows' approach.
All right, thank you. And now, just in terms of this intended further consultation you're going to undertake with the Harbour Master, we'd appreciate it, or I certainly would, if you could, for our benefit, write down the questions that you intend to put to the Harbour Master when he's back at work next week. We can then review those and see if there's anything in addition to that that we would like to know from the Harbour Master. So if you're able to document your questions and send them through to Tamsin, we can review that and add to them if necessary.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Do that.
And are you able to document your questions today or this afternoon?
I can try, yes.
Or
yes,
by the end of tomorrow, by the end of the week?
Yes.
Yeah, that'd be
Yes.
great. Yeah, if you could do that by as soon as possible by the end of the week, and then just wait till you hear back from us before putting the the questions to the Harbour Master in case we wish to add anything to those.
Yes.
All right. Other than that, thank you very much for the work you've done, all of the reporting, and for coming in and answering our questions this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so that brings us to the end of this part of the hearing. Just to confirm, we're going to put some questions in writing from Mr Denny that will be answered in writing. We're going to review the questions Ms Royce is going to put to the Harbour Master, and we may well add to those. Other than that, I don't think there's any further outstanding information from the reporting officers. Is there any further information? No? Okay, so obviously now we're not going to close the hearing because we need that further information, and also we need to receive the applicant's right of reply. So, Ms Irving, just in terms of that, I know it's a difficult question, but do you have any feeling for timeframes? And we don't have any particular time frame in mind or any desire for haste or urgency. We appreciate that there's a lot of work for you to do, so the time needs to be taken that needs to be taken.
My inclination is to perhaps have a backstop date.
Yeah.
And we'll work to file as efficiently as we can. I haven't discussed this with Peter, but just thinking about some of the questions we've got here, I'd like to think we had sort of 3 weeks to a month to do that at the outside, and we'll try and do it faster.
Sure.
But there's a fair bit of input we need from some experts, and I haven't been able to speak with our noise person.
Yes.
So I don't know how long they're going to be and things like that. So,
yeah.
But I'd expect we should be able to turn around inside a month at the outside.
No, that's fine. I appreciate that. Obviously, Ms McKenzie has some work to do, and as you said, the noise expert needs to be engaged and some work done there. Okay, no, that's fine. Just if maybe in a couple of weeks' time, if you could just give Tamsin an update,
Sure.
just to let her know whether or not you're on track, or it might be shorter or longer than that. And of course, it'll be what it'll be. So there's no expectation from us that you should do it quicker or slower. It'd just be nice just to be updated in terms of our own work programs as well.
That's helpful, thank you.
All right. All right, that brings us to the end of today. The hearing's now adjourned. Thank you to everyone for your participation. That's to the applicant, the reporting officers, and especially to the submitters who appeared before us. We found their evidence very helpful. And to the submitters who didn't appear before us, obviously we take your issues into account as well. So that's the end of the day. Goodbye and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.